Elisa Langley closed the last pane of the window, listening to the distant rumble of thunder. The evening rain had finally died down, filling the house with a damp coolness. Wet cicadas chirped loudly in the garden, a clock ticked steadily in the kitchen, and raindrops trickled down the glass, leaving blurry patterns. Alice ran her hand along the windowsill. Water had run onto the wood, and now she had to wipe the puddle away with an old towel. She looked around. House after a thunderstorm seemed especially quiet. The ordinary one-story house on the outskirts of Austin, where she and her husband had lived for 7 years, seemed unusually alien and gloomy today. Perhaps it was the power outages just half an hour ago. A thunderstorm had knocked out the transformer, and the lights were flickering. Now the lamps burned with an even yellow light, reflecting off the damp floor. But the anxious tension did not go away. Elisesh threw the towel into the laundry basket and looked into the living room. Her husband, Nolan Archer, was sitting on the sofa in the semi-darkness. The bluish glow of the screen illuminated his face. Nolan was staring at his laptop, leaning forward. His dark hair fell in disarray over his forehead. He mechanically brushed a strand of it away. Hearing his wife's footsteps, Nolan looked up for a moment. "Is it over yet?" he asked quietly, nodding towards the windows. "Has the rain stopped?" "Yeah, I think so," Alice said. She paused at the doorway, watching her husband. "The power's back. I was cleaning up the leaks." Nolan nodded absently and looked back at the screen. On his lap was a thin silver laptop, the same one he carried around with him for work. Running a creative studio required him to be constantly on, even though it was late on a Sunday night. Usually this was the time they would watch a show together or do something around the house, but that had changed in recent weeks. Alice frowned slightly, remembering how they spent their evenings a year ago. Then they happily chatted over dinner, shared the events of the day, and laughed at trifles. They could suddenly arrange a small celebration in the middle of the week, go to the cinema, or dance in the kitchen to their favorite song. Now her 36-year-old husband increasingly sat silently, citing work. She understood. Owning your own business is stressful. Nolan owned a small creative studio where they did advertising and design, and sometimes he had to work on projects until late. But the feeling that it was not only about work had been growing in her for several days. Elisesh looked at the coffee table. An empty coffee cup, an unfinished book, the TV remote control, everything in its place. An ordinary cozy evening. Only the anxiety in her chest did not give her peace. Maybe she was just nervous about the thunderstorm. Alice had always disliked heavy rains and thunder since childhood. She had been afraid of sudden storms. Now, it seemed, nature itself was trying to tell her something with this noisy rampage of the elements. "Are you okay?" Nolan's voice brought her out of her thoughts. He was staring at her, his eyes narrowed, as if he had just noticed her tension. "Yes, yes, everything is fine," Alice answered too quickly and straightened a strand of dark blonde hair with her hand. "I was just thinking." Nolan closed his laptop and leaned back on the couch. The room was dim, with only a desk lamp illuminating it from the side. For a moment, his face was in shadow, his expression unreadable. "About what?" he asked softly. Alice shrugged. She was trying to find the words. She couldn't just say, "I'm worried that we barely talk." Instead, she moved closer and quietly replied, "Just about work. Tomorrow is Monday." "Oh, I see." Nolan sighed and rubbed his neck, obviously feeling tired too. "You have this project again? A difficult one?" Alice sat down on the edge of the sofa. She worked as a programmer at a small tech company and had indeed been poring over a complex piece of code for the past few days. Usually she enthusiastically discussed interesting problems with her husband, but today she didn't feel like talking about anything. "We're solving a problem with the database," she answered after a pause. "We can't find the bug." "You'll figure it out," he said absent-mindedly. "You're a talent." She saw the shadow of a smile on his face, but it was tired and somehow formal. In the old days, Nolan would have cheered her up with a joke or offered to help, even in jest. Now only routine words. "Thank you," Alice said quietly. They sat in silence for a few minutes. The last flash of lightning flashed outside the window, and the distant echo of thunder reached their ears. Then there was only the chirping of crickets and the noise of cars somewhere in the distance. The storm had finally passed. "I'm glad they got the lights back on so quickly," Nolan said, breaking the silence. "I was just writing a letter to a client, and it almost all went to waste. I had to get my phone out just in case." "Did you turn off the electrical appliances?" she asked automatically. During a thunderstorm, they always tried to turn off the equipment, just in case lightning struck. "Yes, of course," he patted the laptop case. "Okay, I'll finish writing tomorrow morning." Nolan got up from the couch and stretched. Alice watched him go. He was a little taller than her. With an athletic build, he used to run often in the mornings and still went for a run sometimes. In the lamplight, she noticed that her husband looked exhausted. There were circles under his eyes. His shoulders were slumped. Perhaps it was hard for him, too. "I'm going to bed," he said quietly. "I have to get up early tomorrow. I have a meeting with the team." "Of course," Alice nodded. "I'll be there soon, too." She watched Nolan disappear into the hallway, then heard the bed creak in the bedroom. After sitting in the living room for a while, she picked up her husband's empty cup and carried it into the kitchen. The sink was already full of dishes from the day before. They usually did the cleaning together, but lately that duty had fallen to her. Alice suppressed her irritation with an effort and quickly rinsed her cup. The water from the tap rustled evenly and steadily, carrying away the soap suds. She tried to distract herself with her usual activities, but her thoughts returned again to her husband's behavior. In the last couple of months, he seemed to have withdrawn. Blame it on work fatigue. But the creative studio he founded, Archer Creative, was thriving. There had been rough patches, but now, according to Nolan himself, things were going well. There was a new big order from some Texas advertiser. The team was working on a project for a famous brand. He hired a new employee, a project manager, I think, to take the load off himself. All this usually only improved his mood, but at home he became withdrawn. Alisesh noticed the changes a long time ago. She stays late at work more often than usual, sometimes returning in the early morning, citing a rush job. She almost never lets go of her phone, and before she would calmly throw it anywhere. Now she even takes it to the bathroom. At first, she drove away the anxious thoughts, convincing herself that she was just winding herself up. You never know, the business is growing new worries. But an inner voice whispered that the matter was different. She dried her hands and leaned her hip against the kitchen counter. A slender woman with a tired face was visible in the dim reflection of the window. 34 years old, still young, or already at the beginning of middle life, flashed through her mind. Usually at her age, people are either raising children or building a career. She and Nolan had never had children at first. They wanted to live for themselves. Then they kept putting it off for later. And now she suddenly wondered, will there be a later at all? If their marriage is falling apart, will they have a child? The thought made her heart skip a beat. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and sighed. Maybe she was just being pushy. Maybe she wasn't blabbering at all, just a year-long crisis, as they say. They needed to talk, go on vacation together. Yes, maybe they should get away to the ocean, or at least to the lake for the weekend, to get away from work. Alice decided not to jump to conclusions. Tomorrow was a new day. She would sort out the bug at work, cook a delicious dinner in the evening, and try to talk frankly with her husband. Maybe just ask him directly if everything was okay. Maybe there were problems he wasn't talking about. Having made her decision, she felt a little calmer. The storm had passed, and her soul should have relaxed as well. Alisesh turned off the light in the kitchen and went into the bedroom. Nolan was already lying with his back to her half of the bed. His breathing was even, it seemed he was sleeping. She lay down quietly next to him, trying not to disturb him. In the darkness, listening to her husband's measured breathing, Alice thought about what their life would be like in a year. Would they still lie side by side like this? Or was this silence deceptive, and was there something waiting for them ahead that would destroy this peace? She fell asleep with heavy thoughts under the monotonous noise of the air conditioner. which started working again after the power outage. Everything was calm outside the window, nothing foreshadowed trouble. Alice did not know that a much more serious shock awaited her ahead. The next day, Alice woke up a little later than usual. The night had been restless, and in the morning she had difficulty opening her eyes. On the empty half of the bed, the sheet was cold. Nolan had already gotten up. The smell of coffee was coming from the kitchen. For a moment, Alice's heart fluttered with joy. Her husband had made coffee, as he used to. Perhaps today they would be able to talk frankly. However, when she went into the kitchen, she found Nolan already dressed and about to leave. He was standing by the refrigerator, finishing the rest of the coffee from his favorite mug with a studio logo. On the table lay a laptop in a bag next to the car keys. "Hi," Alice said sleepily, leaning her shoulder against the doorframe. "Good morning," he responded, smiling at the corners of his lips. "Didn't I wake you up? Got up early, gotta meet the team." Elisesh nodded, trying to fight off the drowsiness. She usually left for work later than him, since she could sometimes work from home. Today, she had to be at the office by 9, but there was still time. "The coffee is fresh, pour yourself some," Nolan said, gesturing towards the coffee maker. "Thank you." She stepped toward the table. "Are you coming back early today?" She wanted to remind him that they hadn't had dinner together for a long time. Nolan, who was checking the contents of his briefcase, paused for a second, as if thinking. "I'll try to make it around 7 o'clock, he answered evasively. "But I can't promise. We have a project launch coming up." Elisesh held back a sigh. She poured hot coffee into a mug and asked as casually as possible, "By the way, how did that meeting go on Friday?" "Well, with the client you were talking about." She glanced at her husband out of the corner of her eye. He slammed his briefcase shut and glanced briefly at her. "On Friday?" he asked again. "Well, yes, remember, you arrived late. I said I was meeting with a potential client," she reminded him, trying to speak calmly. In fact, it was difficult for her to maintain an even tone. Anxiety was already stirring inside. "Oh yeah, that's right," Nolan smiled tightly. "Everything's fine. We discussed the details. Nothing particularly interesting." He turned away, as if unwilling to go into details. Alice felt his fingers tighten around the mug. "I'm glad to hear it," she managed. "Where did you meet? You didn't say." Nolan hesitated for just a moment, but she managed to notice it. "Oh, just. In the center in a cafe," he answered casually and immediately changed the subject. "Okay, I have to go. See you in the evening, okay?" He stepped toward her, kissed her cheek goodbye faster than usual, and headed for the exit. Alice stood in the kitchen, listening to the footsteps retreating down the hall and the click of the front door closing. She slowly put the mug down on the table. Her heart was beating dully and heavily, downtown in a cafe, but she knew that he was actually in the restaurant La Belle Vie. For a few seconds, Alice just stood there, feeling the blood drain from her face. He had lied to her. He had lied now, he had lied then on Friday. That evening, she distinctly remembers Nolan calling at around 6 to say he had a meeting with a potential client and would have to stay late. She, of course, said, "Okay, good luck." She remembered eating dinner alone, texting a friend, and going to bed around midnight, still waiting for her husband. He arrived at almost 1 in the morning, apologizing, saying the meeting had dragged on, but at least it had gone well. Alice had sleepily joked that she hoped the client was worth the lost evening. He had simply kissed her and said he would tell her the details later, but he never did. Now everything fell into place. The restaurant, La Belle Vie, is one of the most expensive in Austin. He would not have dined there with any mere potential client. The studio budget would not approve of this, and there were no talks about such important clients. Besides, he said, in a cafe, so he deliberately concealed it. Alice took a deep breath, trying to stop her hands from shaking. She went to the coat rack by the entrance, where her husband's jacket, which he had worn yesterday, was hanging on a hook. The jacket was thrown carelessly over the hook, one sleeve turned inside out. Alice mechanically adjusted it and suddenly felt the rustle of paper in her pocket. Puzzled, she stuck her hand inside and took out a narrow rectangle of paper folded in half. It was a restaurant bill, printed out on thin thermal paper by a terminal. The date was last Friday night, time 9:15 p.m. The lines read, 2 main courses, an appetizer, a bottle of expensive red wine, dessert. At the bottom was the total, a hefty sum, and a signature in pen. Thank you. F. The letter F was probably the name of the waiter or waitress. But in Alice's mind, another name that started with that letter popped into her head. Felicity. She remembered Nolan mentioning a new employee a couple of weeks ago, on the eve of the new quarter. She's smart, he'd said over breakfast. Name's Felicity Reed, moved from San Francisco, used to work for a big agency, hired her as a project manager. Alice had nodded at the time. New girls showed up at her husband's place of work from time to time, nothing out of the ordinary. Felicity. The name is beautiful, rare. Now Alice couldn't get it out of her head. The letter F on the waiter's signature made her heart clench. Stupid, of course. It wasn't at all necessary that it was connected, but her intuition was already putting two and two together. Alice smoothed out the crumpled receipt. Friday night, Nolan and a potential client. An expensive restaurant. Who was with him? The client? Or that Felicity? Stop it, Alice said out loud to herself. Don't get worked up. She sank into a chair in the hallway, still staring at the pale gray check in her hands. If it really was a colleague, and even if it was a work meeting, why lie? Why say just a cafe when they were having dinner at the best restaurant in town? The answer was obvious, but she didn't want to accept it. Alice shook her head stubbornly and pulled out her phone. The time showed on the screen 8:20, time to leave for work. But at that moment, everything else ceased to matter. She quickly found her husband's number in her contacts. Her fingers hovered over the call button. What would she tell him? Ask him straight out, who were you with at La Belle Vie on Friday? And he would either lie again or confess. Unlikely. More likely, he would get angry that she was controlling him, that she was rummaging through his pockets. No, there was no point in having such a conversation now. She needed to think it over first. Alicesh put the phone away and looked at the receipt again. Then she carefully folded it and tucked it deep into her wallet. Let it be. This was her first piece of evidence, so to speak. She was late for work after all. The whole way, while she was stuck in traffic, the same questions were spinning in her head. Who is this Felicity Reed, that new employee? Young, beautiful. Why did Nolan talk about her with such admiration? Maybe they had a purely business relationship. But then why would they have dinner together in the evening? In the office, she could barely concentrate. Code, numbers, bugs, everything swam before her eyes. A colleague in the department, Anwar, noticed that she was not herself today and even offered to drink coffee if her head was not working. Alice muttered that she simply did not get enough sleep. Alone at her desk, she opened her browser and typed Felicity Reed Austin into the search bar. Her fingers shook. The page flickered with results. The first links were a LinkedIn profile, a couple of industry news mentions. Alice clicked on LinkedIn. The photo showed a pretty blonde in her early 30s wearing a business suit. Felicity Reed, project manager at Archer Creative. There she is. Originally from San Francisco, as Nolan said, judging by her previous place of work. Education, University of Washington. Married or not. This status was not reflected on the social network, but a ring on her ring finger flashed in the profile photo. She's married, Alice thought, feeling a strange sense of relief. If Felicity was married, she probably wasn't, although married women cheated too. The conclusion surfaced immediately and stung. At the bottom of the page, links to other social networks appeared. Alice found Felicity's Facebook profile, but it was closed by privacy settings. Only a photo was visible. The same woman, but next to her, a dark-haired, strong-built man hugging her around the waist. The caption, Felicity and Victor, Austin 2023. Victor, so the husband's name is Victor. A married couple. It would seem like an ordinary happy family. And yet, Alice feverishly closed the tab. She suddenly felt ashamed, digging into someone else's life at work. But the desire to know the truth was stronger than the shame. She simply felt the need to make sure that she had misunderstood the situation, that Felicity was just a loyal employee helping her husband, and that the dinner was part of the job. But Nolan's lie couldn't get out of his head. He had no reason to hide it if the dinner had been businesslike. Why did he lie then? Elisesh turned off the monitor and tiredly rubbed her temples. By lunchtime, she realized that the workday was lost for her. She had zero concentration. Having asked her boss for time off under the pretext of feeling unwell, she went home early. The empty house only made her feel more anxious. She tried to eat, but barely touched it. She kept thinking about the check, about Felicity, about the lie. Later in the evening, a message came from Nolan. Going to stay late, dinner without me. That's all. Before, he would at least add a smiley or a heart, but now it's just a dry notification. Elisesh read the text message and felt an icy lump in her chest. Well, that gave her time. Time to think about what to do. She didn't want any conversations with her husband yet. She needed facts. The more the better. She went upstairs to the office where her laptop was. If Nolan was at work late again, why not check to see if the lights were actually on in the studio office? A simple thought, but it had never occurred to her to spy on her husband before. Now Alice saw no other way out, or her doubts would drive her crazy. She sat down at the table, opened her laptop, and began to develop a plan, not even yet fully realizing what a dangerous path she was taking. Late Monday night, Alice parked her car across the street from Archer Creative's office. The office was in an old brick building in downtown Austin. Usually the lights were still on in the evening. The team sometimes worked late on deadlines. But now, all the windows were dark. Elisesh glanced at the clock on her dashboard, 10:47. Nolan had texted her 3 hours ago that he would be working late into the night. Still working? She thought, even though she had already seen the reply with her own eyes. No sign of life. His car was gone from the empty parking lot. Nolan's silver sedan was missing from its usual spot under the streetlight. She felt a twinge of pain and a strange, cold calm at the same time. The fact he was not at work, although he insisted otherwise, that meant he was somewhere else, with someone. No excuses could convince her otherwise. Alice sat in the car with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. For several minutes, she watched the silent facade of the building opposite, hoping to see a belated light in a window or the shadow of a moving person. But nothing changed. It was completely dark. Cars occasionally drove along the deserted street. Somewhere in the distance, a car honked, and silence reigned again. Enough, she finally decided. There was no point in sitting here any longer. Nolan was lying to her. Who was he with now? The first thing that came to mind was her Felicity, but her mind demanded proof. Elisesh started the engine and smoothly pulled out onto the road. She didn't want to go home, only silence and heavy thoughts awaited her there. But driving around the city at night without a goal was also useless. She felt a determination to act growing inside her. If the truth was hidden in the data, she would find it. When Alice got home, she headed straight to the bedroom. On the nightstand was the charger for Nolan's fitness tracker. He rarely took the tracker off, except to charge it in the bathroom. The tracker wasn't on the nightstand now, so he was wearing it. An idea flashed through her mind. The tracker synced with her phone. Maybe she could track his location through his fitness app. She dismissed the idea almost immediately. She didn't know how to access his bracelet account, and it was unlikely that it had GPS. Something more reliable was needed. Alice sat down at her laptop. The screen lit up the room with a cold light. She opened the browser and went to the website of the mobile operator that had their family plan. She had never looked at the detailed reports before. There was no need. Now she scrolled through the call and message history for the past months. The list was long, but a curious detail quickly emerged. Starting around November, just as Felicity was arriving, the reports often included an unfamiliar number with a San Francisco area code. Nolan regularly called or received calls from this number late at night. There was a call at 11:47 p.m. on November 24th, an evening when he had supposedly been working late on a presentation. There was a series of texts at nearly midnight on December 5th, and she recalled him going out for a walk before bed. Even on New Year's Eve, the number kept popping up when he took his phone out onto the patio just before midnight. Alice's heart sank as the facts confirmed the worst. The number was repeated several times a week, most often between 10 p.m. and midnight, and almost always on days when Nolan was late at work. Alicesh felt her heart pounding. She wrote the number down on a piece of paper. 7 digits, a familiar code. Perhaps it was Felicity Reed's personal number. If she had recently moved, she might have kept her California number. Next messages. The operator did not show the details of the SMS, only the number and time. But almost every time after a call, several messages appeared in the reports, sometimes 20 or 30 in a row, as in a long correspondence. Alice nervously bit her lip. You can try calling this number anonymously or from another phone, but what will it give you? Hear a voice. No, it's too early now. She pulled up the page for her bank account. They didn't have joint accounts, but Alice had logins to her credit cards they'd once paid for a vacation together, and she'd retained access. She entered the password to her husband's main card and held her breath. A second later, the system let her in. The password hadn't changed since last year. A list of transactions appeared on the screen. Most were routine: supermarket, gas, internet bills. But there were some that stood out. A Marriott hotel downtown, a one-night stay, dated 2 weeks earlier. Alice remembered Nolan had said he was staying overnight at work because of an urgent project. It turned out he hadn't been staying at the office at all. She found other suspicious expenses: a lingerie boutique at the beginning of the month, a jewelry store 6 months ago, although she had received a gold bracelet from him as a gift for their wedding anniversary, so he had made that purchase for her. But the lingerie was definitely not for her. They had never bought anything like that together, and she hadn't specified the size. Her fingers trembled as she leafed through the recent statements. There were also restaurant bills in addition to La Belle Vie. There were other, smaller ones, probably lunches on weekdays. Perhaps he had taken Felicity to a cafe near the office. Each event could be explained individually, but together they formed a frightening picture. Alice sat back in her chair after jotting down the hotel names and dates. There was little doubt now. Her husband wasn't just flirting on the side, he was having a full-blown affair. An affair with a woman who was also cheating on her husband. She closed her eyes, trying to pull herself together. The emotions were trying to overwhelm her: rage, hurt, fear of the unknown. But above all, a cold determination was growing. Inside, a cold determination was growing, hard and unyielding. She would see this through to the end. As a programmer, Alice was used to looking for logical solutions. And now the situation required a plan, clear actions. Simply rushing to Nolan with shouts would be a mistake. He would either deny everything or dodge, and most importantly, he would understand that she knew something, and would become more careful. No, it would be better to collect all the evidence, and then she would decide what to do. Alice opened a blank text file and began listing what she had managed to find out. Frequent calls to the 415 San Francisco area code during the evening and night hours. His correspondence during the same period. Restaurant bill for 2 on Friday. Paid night at Marriott Hotel November, 1 night. Spending money at a lingerie store March 3rd. Tears came to her eyes as she typed the last words. She distantly noted to herself that she was listing the facts of her own family disaster point by point, like a list of bugs in a program. But how to fix this situation was still unclear. She took a deep breath and wiped away the tears with the back of her hand. This was no time to be down. There was a next step. Her gaze fell on a printed photo on the table, an old snapshot from their trip to Seattle. In the photo, she and Nolan were laughing in the rain, holding hands. She had thought then that happiness would last forever. Alice clenched her fists. This photo reminded her of something important. They were in Seattle with friends, and there they met a couple who had gone through infidelity. That woman then told Alice a phrase that she remembered forever. If you find out about infidelity, collect evidence and only then act, because you will do stupid things on emotions. Well, the advice was timely. There was already enough evidence. But Alice decided that it wasn't enough. She had to see it for herself, and maybe give Nolan and his mistress a sense of security before she struck back. She opened her browser and went to Felicity Reed's social media page, which she had looked at that morning. A photo with her husband, Victor. What was this person feeling now? Did he know something, or was he being deceived too? And then Alice realized what her next step would be. She didn't have to go through this alone. There was another person who had been deceived. Victor Reed, Felicity's husband. Finding his contact information wasn't difficult. A little searching, and she found the website of a veterinary clinic with his name on it. Victor Reed, veterinarian. Clinic phone number, address. Alicesh raised her hand over the keyboard. She wouldn't call now, at night, of course, but she could send an email. There was a general email address for communication on the clinic's website. She hesitated, imagining how to formulate such a letter. Finally, she wrote a short message, choosing her words carefully, that she was Nolan Archer's wife and wanted to talk confidentially about her spouses. She gave him her personal number and asked him to call back at his convenience. After sending the letter, Alice felt the tension ease a little. Now she was no longer alone with her troubles. At least she tried to reach out to someone who might be going through the same thing. She decided, if there was no answer, then tomorrow she would try to contact Victor directly, calling him personally. On Tuesday afternoon, at exactly 1 p.m., Alice's phone vibrated on the table. An unfamiliar number with a local code appeared on the screen. Her heart jumped. Maybe it was him. She hurried out of the open plan office into the corridor and replied, "Hello. Is this Alice Langley?" A male voice rang out, sounding tense. "Yes." She pressed the phone closer to her ear. "Victor." "Yes, Victor Reed," the voice confirmed. "I received your letter. We really need to talk." Alice closed her eyes, feeling both relief and fear. Victor's voice was calm, but there was a hidden excitement in it. "Thank you for calling back," she said quietly. "I'm sorry to address you like this. It's just, there's no other way." "You're right," he interrupted. "Don't apologize. I thought I was going crazy alone. I'm glad you wrote." There was an awkward silence. Then Victor spoke again, more collectedly. "It would be better to meet in person. Could you do it today?" Alicesh nodded quickly, although he couldn't see it. "Yes, of course. As you wish. I can do it after work, around 6 or 7 o'clock. My clinic closes at 7, Victor said. "Let's do it there, at my place. You probably know the address from the website." "I know," she confirmed. "Okay. Come around 7:15 when I finish my appointment. It will be private." "Thank you. See you later," Alice whispered. She hung up and stood there for a few seconds, leaning her back against the cool wall. Her heart was beating like crazy. There was no turning back now. Alice was restless for the rest of the day. 1,000 thoughts raced through her head. What would Victor say? How would he react to her evidence? What if he changed his mind or told his wife everything in advance? But something in his voice, the restrained pain, the determination told her he was on her side. Later that evening, Alice left work early, lying to her colleagues that she had urgent business. She stopped at home for literally 10 minutes to pick up the notes with her findings and grab that very receipt from the restaurant. She couldn't wait to finally look into the eyes of the man whose life was possibly falling apart just like her own. Victor Reed's clinic was on a quiet street in the northern part of town. A small, one-story building with a green sign, Dr. Reed's Veterinary Clinic. It was getting dark when Alice pulled up. She turned off the engine and saw the last customer walking out of the clinic with a cat carrier. She was followed by a man in a dark blue shirt, probably Victor himself. He walked the client out, waved goodbye, and turned around to see Alice's car. She got out, her knees shaking. "Dr. Reed," she called softly, coming closer. In the low light of the lantern, Alice could see his face. Victor was a little older than her, about 40, with a short dark beard and tired eyes. His gaze was wary but friendly. "Call me Victor," he said softly. "You must be Alice." Yes, she tried to smile, but her lips wouldn't obey. For a few seconds they hesitated, not knowing how to start this conversation. Finally, Victor opened the door wider and invited, "Come inside. There's no one here except us." Alice entered the clinic. A faint smell of medicine and something similar to bleach hit her nose, the usual smell of a veterinary clinic. The reception area was dimly lit, smelling of disinfectant and medicine. Photos of cured pets hung on the walls. Old issues of veterinary journals lay on the coffee table. This atmosphere was strangely calming. Here they were treated, not crippled. Victor pointed to a small sofa for visitors. "Have a seat." He sat down next to her, at some distance. They looked at each other in silence for a few moments. Alice noticed that his eyes were red, as if he, too, had hardly slept. He, in turn, glanced at her pale face. "I'm glad you wrote to me," Victor broke the silence. "Although the word glad doesn't quite fit here. All in all, it's good that we're not alone in this trouble." Alice felt a lump in her throat. He called it a disaster, and it made her feel both lighter and heavier. Did you suspect anything before my letter?" she asked quietly. Victor lowered his eyes and tiredly rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Honestly, yes. 6 years of marriage, everything seemed to be settled. But in the last few months, I didn't recognize my wife. There was no evidence. Felicity began to distance herself. She was always at work, spent her evenings on the phone, and often went somewhere. I tried to talk, but she blamed stress and a lot of work on a new project. I wanted to believe." He sighed heavily and continued. "A week ago, I accidentally saw her texting at night. She thought I was asleep. I briefly saw the name Nolan in the message window before she closed the screen. That's when I began to suspect the worst." Alice covered her mouth with her hand. For some reason, hearing her husband's name from this unknown man was especially painful. Victor cast an apologetic glance at her. "Sorry, you probably don't like to hear that." "It's okay," she lowered her hand. "I need to know the whole truth." "I've never encountered anything like this before," Victor admitted hoarsely. "I didn't know what to do. I thought I could just ask her directly, but I was afraid of the answer. And then your letter. To be honest, I was even glad. I decided I'll finally find out everything." Alicesh nodded. She was a little ashamed to admit it, but she had already collected a whole archive of evidence. "I have proof," she said, trying to keep her voice level. She opened her bag and pulled out a printed sheet of paper with a list. "I probably dug too deep. I just wanted to be sure." She handed Victor the paper, and he pulled the nearest table lamp over to read it. Alice watched his eyes run over the lines. "Calls to your number 415. Late in the evening. Correspondence, many messages on the same days. Bill from La Belle Vie restaurant for dinner for 2 Friday, the 7th of April. Payment for a room at the Marriott Hotel November, 1 night. Women's lingerie store March 3rd. Victor's hands were visibly shaking as he held the paper. He shook his head in disbelief. "You've done some serious work," he said quietly. "Then it's true." Alice felt a pang of doubt. What if she took the initiative in vain? What if he was in too much pain now? "Sorry, perhaps I shouldn't have shown you all this so quickly," she began. But Victor raised his palm, stopping her. "No, no, it's good that you did." He looked her straight in the eye, and Alice saw anger fighting with bitterness in his gaze. "I can't deceive myself now. It all fits together." He paused, then added with difficulty. "Felicity was at that hotel in November too, supposedly for a late-night strategy session with the team. Shit." He threw the paper on the table and covered his face with his hands. Victor sat like that for a few moments, and Alice didn't know what to do. Then he exhaled loudly and dropped his hands. Moisture glinted in his eyes, but his voice was firm. "Thank you. Without you, I would probably have lived in ignorance for a long time. Alice smiled sadly. I didn't want to believe it at first either, but the facts. She took a receipt from La Belle Vie out of her wallet. She carefully unfolded it and put it in front of Victor. Here, I found it at my husband's. I think they were there together at dinner. Victor glanced quickly at the check. Yes, that night Felicity said she would be working late. They must have had dinner. He pointed to the list. And the calls. This is my number. Did you find my number in your details? Yes, Alice confirmed. I didn't know it was yours then. I just had a hunch. The area code is San Francisco, and your wife's number is probably from there. That's right, he nodded. Although she now has a local work phone in Austin, her personal one is an old one from California. Both fell silent. The assembled puzzles formed a single picture, painful, ugly, but real. Alice felt another lump rise in her throat. But now was not the time for weakness. She swallowed hard and asked, "What are we going to do?" Victor thought for a moment, clasping his fingers and looking sullenly at the floor. Then he straightened up. "If you don't mind, I suggest we act together." Coldly and sensibly, he smiled bitterly at these words. They led us by the nose in cold blood. We must not lose our composure. Alicesh felt relieved by his decisive tone. She nodded. I agree. Together. Good. Then first we'll collect everything we can. Evidence, witnesses, I don't know. Victor spoke more and more confidently, so that when we present it, they'll have nothing to counter it with. Yes, she continued. I have a friend who works in a private detective agency. I can consult with her. Or we can. Follow him, for example. We can do it ourselves, Victor said thoughtfully. The main thing is to be careful so that they don't suspect it ahead of time. He glanced at the calendar hanging on the wall in the reception area. You know what's interesting, Victor began slowly. In a week, Felicity was going on a business trip for a couple of days. To Denver. She said she and her boss were going to meet with a client. Alice tensed. Nolan hadn't told her anything about Denver, but if Felicity had mentioned it. Most likely, she said slowly, Nolan is also preparing to tell me about the business trip to Denver. That means they are planning to go there together. Victor clenched his fists. Great. Let's give them a warm welcome in Denver. Catching them red-handed is the surest way to go. Alicesh licked her lips nervously. The idea of sneaking up on them in this distant city seemed scary, but logical. I can take a day off and go, she said. If necessary, I can buy a ticket on the same flight, but they can't see me. I'll organize everything too, Victor nodded. Felicity thought I'd be at the conference those days, but I'll cancel. He said it with such grim determination that Alice felt a little creeped out. But she understood him. The same cold fury was seething inside her now. They discussed the details for another half hour. They agreed to exchange news and meet before the trip. They decided not to refuse the help of a private detective if surveillance on the spot was required. Every little thing mattered. When all was said, there was a pause. Alice looked at Victor. He looked exhausted, but collected. How are you? She asked quietly. Victor tried to smile, but it came out sad. I don't know myself. Better than yesterday, because now everything is clear. But worse, of course, than when I still hoped that it was a mistake. Alice lowered her eyes. Me too. But at least we don't go crazy alone. That's right, he nodded. We can handle it. He stood up, and she stood up too. Victor extended his hand, offering to shake it. Alice hesitated for a second, then decisively shook his palm. Thank you, he said sincerely. Thank you, she replied. See you later, Victor. See you later, Alice, he said quietly. She turned and stepped out into the cool night air. Her heart was pounding, but now not with fear, but with determination. The puzzle was complete, and now the next step lay ahead, carrying out the sentence. Alice sat in her car in the parking lot of a small Italian restaurant, nervously tapping her fingers on the steering wheel. Wednesday's dusk was gathering outside. In the rearview mirror, she saw Victor's dark gray SUV pull neatly into the adjacent parking space. They agreed to spend the evening in surveillance mode. In the afternoon, Nolan told his wife that he would be busy at work until late again preparing a presentation for a client, and Felicity threw a phrase to her husband in the morning that her colleagues were going out for a glass of wine after work, and she might join in. It sounded suspicious enough. Alice and Victor immediately contacted and decided. It seemed like a great chance to catch the cheaters together. Victor got out of his car and quickly crossed the space between them. Alice opened the passenger window, and he leaned over. "Are they inside yet?" he asked quietly. "Nolan came by about 10 minutes ago," Alice whispered, though no one in the car could hear her. "I saw him park right there by the entrance." She pointed to her husband's familiar silver sedan, parked right at the restaurant's porch. "Felicity's not here," she added. "She'll probably drive up from the other side or take a taxi." Victor nodded and walked around, getting into the passenger seat of her car. "I brought a camera," he said, patting the leather bag over his shoulder. "It has a good zoom, if I can get a few shots." Alice felt a pang of anxiety. It was like a bad detective story, surveillance, a camera. In recent days, she had caught herself thinking more than once that her life had suddenly turned into a scene from a movie she never wanted to star in. "Just be careful," she whispered. "Don't let the lens get too close to the window, or they might notice the glare." Victor looked at her gratefully. "Got it. I'll try." They sat next to each other in the cramped space of the salon, and Alice felt the tension ringing between them. The situation had brought them closer together a week ago. They had been strangers, and now, without any prior agreement, they acted as a well-coordinated team. A few more minutes passed. From time to time, customers left the restaurant, and some came in. Victor carefully studied the entrance with binoculars, which he unexpectedly took out of the glove compartment of his bag. "You're really prepared," Alice couldn't help but say when she saw the binoculars. He was a little embarrassed. "These are marine binoculars. I used to take them for bird watching. Now they come in handy." Alicesh wanted to smile, but she couldn't. Her heart was pounding somewhere in her throat. She checked her watch, 1952. Usually at this time, she and Nolan were having dinner at home, chatting about trivialities. And now this. "It's so quiet," she murmured, nodding toward the restaurant entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see tables, dim lights, couples dining. "Do you think they're inside yet?" "Most likely," Victor answered. "They could have come earlier." He pressed his eye to the binoculars again. At that moment, a dark taxi pulled up smoothly to the restaurant. Alice immediately recognized the slender figure that stepped out of the car. Felicity. High heels, a tight dark blue dress, light hair styled in waves. She paid the driver and walked quickly to the entrance. A smile lit up her face, obviously anticipating a pleasant evening. Victor exhaled through his teeth. Here she is. Alice looked away. Even from a distance of tens of meters, she noticed Felicity had put on makeup, a beautiful dress clearly not just to sit with colleagues over a drink. "Let's go," Victor said. He was already getting out of the car, throwing the strap of his camera bag over his shoulder. Alice followed him, trying to keep in the shadow of the trees that lined the sidewalk. The restaurant was on the first floor of an old mansion. There was a front entrance in the front, and perhaps a back exit or kitchen windows on the side. Victor gestured to go around the building. They crept as quietly as the gravel paths allowed them to the side. There was indeed a large window with frosted glass, probably into the kitchen. Further on was a door for the staff, now closed. Further down the wall was another window, through which they could see the hall, partly covered by a thin curtain. Victor looked in first, then stepped back, motioning to Alice. She peered out cautiously. The far end of the room was in view. There, by the wall, two people were sitting at a small round table. Alice recognized the profile of her husband at once. He was leaning toward his interlocutor, toward Felicity, of course. Their table was under a lamp, and their faces were sufficiently illuminated. Alice's heart sank painfully, but she forced herself not to look away. She needed to soak this picture in. Even if it hurt, there was no hope left. It was all true, and it was time to think not with her heart, but with her cold mind. Nolan was holding a menu in his hands, saying something. Felicity laughed, leaning closer. They looked like a typical happy couple on a date. For a second, Alice's eyesight blurred with tears. But behind her, there was a clicking sound. Victor had already taken the first picture through the lens of the camera, which he had pushed between the sashes of the slightly open window. Alice wiped the corners of her eyes and also took out her phone. Although it was inferior to a professional camera, she could try to shoot a short video. She pointed the phone camera at the window and zoomed in. The frame captured part of the table where Nolan touched Felicity's palm with his. She didn't pull her hand away, on the contrary, she covered his hand with hers, continuing to smile radiantly. "Oh God," Alice moaned to herself, but held the phone. In the pitch-black silence, the only sound was her own blood pulsing in her temples. Felicity suddenly stood up from the table and, taking Nolan by the hand, led him somewhere into the depths of the hall, probably to the exit, or perhaps to the toilets hidden behind the column. Alice managed to film them walking, holding hands. Victor also followed their movement with his lens. "They're leaving," he whispered. "Maybe they'll go outside now." "Back," Alice commanded, moving away from the window. They quickly rounded the corner of the building, heading back to the parking lot. Sure enough, a minute later, the couple appeared at the entrance, Nolan and Felicity, side by side. He was talking to her quietly, and she was laughing, taking his arm. Together, they headed toward his car. Alice and Victor hid behind a hedge along the parking lot. "They're leaving now," Victor whispered. "We need to find out where." "Let's go after them," Alice responded, trying to keep her voice from shaking. Nolan opened the passenger door of his sedan for Felicity, and she climbed in. He walked around and settled in behind the wheel. The headlights blinked, and the car moved smoothly from its place. "Quickly, in the car," Alice said quietly. They ran back to her car. Alice got behind the wheel, Victor sat next to her, and he immediately turned off the interior light so that they wouldn't be noticed when they opened the doors. The silver sedan pulled out of the parking lot onto the street. Alice waited a couple of seconds and carefully followed, keeping her distance. "Try not to come any closer," Victor warned. "There aren't many cars in this part of town at night." "I know," she answered shortly, trying to keep her distance but not lose sight of them. Nolan drove confidently and slowly. The sedan drove a few blocks, turned onto the eastbound highway. Alice remembered in that direction, about 5 kilometers away, there was a small motel at the exit from the city. Her heart sank. Was that where they were heading? There were hardly any cars around, and Alice soon had to increase her distance to avoid being seen in the mirrors. It helped that there was a truck ahead, which she could hide behind. 10 minutes later, they did indeed see the neon sign of the motel ahead. Nolan's sedan slowed and pulled into the parking lot in front of it. Alice turned off the headlights and stopped in the darkness at the side of the road, about 100 meters behind. From a distance, Nolan could be seen parking under a streetlight, getting out and opening the door for Felicity. Then they disappeared together through the door of the motel reception. There was no point in following further. Motels, rooms, everything is clear without words. Victor leaned back heavily in his seat. In the dim light of the dashboard, Alice could see his jaw tense. "We'd better go back," she said quietly. "We've got what we wanted." He was silent, staring ahead with a glassy gaze. Alice gently touched his elbow. "Victor." He woke up and exhaled. Yes, we're going back," he whispered. Elisesh turned the car around and drove away, trying not to look at the bright motel sign in the mirror. Everything inside her went numb. Not even tears came, only emptiness and the cold awareness of what had happened. "I managed to take them off," Victor said suddenly after a minute of silence, his voice sounding muffled. "At the restaurant, when they were walking to the car, you should have seen that they were holding hands." "Okay," Alice responded almost automatically. "I'm sorry, he began, but stopped short. Alice glanced sideways at him. Victor was sitting, covering his eyes with his hand. She understood. Right now, it was probably even harder for him than for her. He and Felicity had been married for almost 10 years. They were planning to have children. He had told her about this in passing yesterday, apparently trying to explain why he had turned a blind eye to the warning signs for so long. "No need to apologize," she said softly. "I can't stand to see it either." "We had to," he said a little more firmly, removing his hand from his face. "It's necessary so that later, when they deny it." Alice nodded. Yes, now they had more than just a check or phone bills. Now they had photos and videos that made everything crystal clear. She brought Victor back to the restaurant where his car was left. She stopped next to him without turning off the engine. "Thanks for the ride," he said quietly. "Hold on," was all Alice could answer. Victor opened the door, but hesitated, then suddenly leaned back and looked into her eyes. "You know what helps me? I think about the end of this story, about how we will hold them accountable. I imagine their faces, and it becomes easier." Elisesh smiled sadly with the corner of her lips. "Yes, me too." He nodded, got out, and headed for his SUV. Alice watched him go, then drove slowly home. That night she did not sleep again, but this time her thoughts were not focused on the pain, but on the coming retribution. On Thursday afternoon, Alice returned to Victor's clinic. It was an unusually sunny day for April, but she hardly noticed the whether her thoughts were preoccupied with the steps ahead. Victor met her at the service entrance. The clinic was empty at the time. He had a window between appointments. They went into a small office where patients' cases were usually discussed. Today, on the table in front of Victor lay a laptop and a stack of printed photographs. "Come in," he said quietly, closing the door behind Alice. He looked tired but focused. Elisesh sat down on the chair opposite, noticing that the email was open on the laptop screen. "I'm here to make a list of who we'll send materials to," Victor explained, nodding at the monitor. "Materials?" she asked again. He smiled bitterly. "Evidence, in other words. I scanned the photo we took yesterday, and I'd like to add your video too." Alice looked at the file open on the table with a copy of her divorce petition. The lawyer promised that at exactly 9 a courier would deliver the original to Nolan directly at the office. Simultaneously, the same courier was supposed to hand over the papers to Felicity at her agency. Everything was going according to plan. She stood up, feeling her legs tremble slightly from the adrenaline rush. She went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. She drank it in small sips, listening to the silence. An unusually quiet morning. The phone vibrated. Alice jumped, put down her glass. A message from Nolan. "Where are you?" Then immediately a second. "We need to talk, urgently." She ignored them. As soon as she unlocked the screen, new notifications poured in. 5, 10, 15, one after another. Nolan was calling, texting, seemingly nonstop. Alice watched as fragments of his desperate messages flashed on the screen. What does this all mean? Is this some kind of mistake? Please answer. Then, let's discuss it. Don't do anything stupid. And finally, how could you send this to everyone? At the last message, Alice smiled bitterly. How could she? How could he? A few minutes later, the phone came to life with another call. An unknown city number was displayed, probably the office. Perhaps it was one of her colleagues or even one of the clients to whom she had sent the mailing list. She didn't want to check. She turned off the sound and put the phone away. Meanwhile, at Archer Creative, Nolan Archer was pacing around his office, sweating profusely. Half an hour earlier, he had been serenely drinking his morning coffee at a planning meeting when he heard several employees let out surprised exclamations. Then manager Steve pulled him aside and whispered, "Nolan, did you see that? What's going on?" As he showed him an email with photos attached. In the photo, Nolan saw himself kissing Felicity at the hotel door. His heart sank. Nolan grabbed Steve's phone and quickly flipped through the letter. There were pictures from a restaurant, from a bar, a video of him hugging Felicity on the street, all accompanied by a dry signature from Alice Langley. FYI, This is what happens on business trips. The letter was sent to a wide range of recipients, his colleagues, several longtime clients, even his father. His throat was dry. He rushed to his office, hoping to call his wife. Alice's phone was not answering. Then he rushed to write to her, to justify himself, to beg her to call. Panic was growing. Before he could come to his senses, the secretary peered into the office door, pale. "There's a courier here. They gave you." She was holding an envelope. Nolan tore off the seal with trembling fingers, taking out the papers. His vision swam. It was a divorce suit and a property division agreement. "Damn," he whispered, realizing that it was all over. At the same time, across town, in the office of a marketing agency, Felicity Reed stood in the middle of the hallway, unable to stop shaking. She held her phone in her hand, the same photos from Denver open on the screen. Just this morning, when she entered the building, she was smiling, remembering a wonderful weekend, and now, some of her colleagues were already whispering behind her back. At that very moment, her boss was walking towards her, holding a package of documents in his hands, exactly the same lawsuit, only addressed to her. Felicity remembered how a couple of hours ago she heard from a friend that a strange letter about her had arrived in the corporate mail. Her heart sank into her heels. And here was the confirmation. Victor knew everything. Not just knew, he spread it to all his acquaintances. Felicity felt herself getting sick. She ran out of the office, ignoring his calls. Outside, she took out her phone and dialed Victor's number with trembling fingers. It rang endlessly. He didn't pick up. She texted, "Please talk to me." There was no answer. At that moment, the phone in her hand shook from the ringing. It was Nolan. Felicity pressed the answer button with a shaking finger. "Did you see?" was all she could say through her tears into the phone. "Yes." Nolan's voice responded hoarsely. He spoke in a whisper, hidden in his office. "Oh, God, what do we do?" "I don't know." Felicity sobbed. "Victor isn't answering. You, Alice, too." "Yes," he breathed. There was a pause, filled with their heavy breathing. For the first time, the lovers did not know what to say to each other. The feeling of euphoria that had connected them only yesterday had evaporated. Only horror remained. "I have to go," Nolan finally said dully. "Later." He didn't finish and cut the connection. Felicity looked at the dark screen and felt absolute despair. Victor stood in the empty operating room of his clinic. The workday had not yet begun, and he had deliberately postponed all appointments until Tuesday. He stared at the screen of his phone, where his wife's name and messages flashed. With each new call, his resolve grew stronger. No talking. Let her feel what it was like to helplessly try to get through when your whole world was collapsing. Victor sent Alice a quick text. "Done. Looks like they got their fill." A minute later, she replied, "Yes, everything is according to plan. Hang in there." He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool wall. Bitterness and strange satisfaction mixed in his chest. A silent bomb had exploded, destroying two lives at once. Their former lovers wanted secret passion. Now they would get open shame. Elisa, meanwhile, she sat on the porch of her house, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her phone no longer vibrated. Perhaps Nolan, shocked, had finally realized the futility of trying. She raised her face to the clear morning sky. No tears, no joy, only desolation and peace. In the silence of that morning, she felt it was all over. Quietly and without shouting, she had cut off her past, finally and irrevocably. The pain was yet to come, but later. Now she felt only fatigue and relief. The alarm bell that had started with the first suspicious check had now died down. Ahead was to begin another melody, her new life, in which there would be no place for lies. Late Monday afternoon, Alice sat on the patio of a small coffee shop in downtown Austin, wrapped in a light sweater. A cappuccino was cooling in front of her. She barely touched it, staring at the traffic. The clock said 6 o'clock. The morning shock gave way to a heavy emptiness. No joy of victory, no grief, just exhaustion, as if after a long night of insomnia. This was the Monday hangover, when all the decisive actions have already been taken and the fragments of the previous life remain ahead. Have you been waiting for a long time? A calm voice rang out. Alice looked up. Victor was standing at the table, holding a cup of black coffee. She shook her head. No, I just arrived too. He sat down on the chair opposite. Both were silent for a while. Finally, Victor asked, "How are you?" Alice shrugged, looking at the empty sky between the city rooftops. "It's empty," she answered honestly. "And you?" He nodded. They fell silent again. Words seemed unnecessary, both understood each other's state. "Did Nolan continue writing?" Victor asked quietly. Alicesh took out her phone. The screen showed 48 unread messages from her husband and several dozen missed calls. "Yes, they kept coming all day," she said wearily. "I didn't answer." "No need," Victor agreed. "Mine tried to call too. I turned off my phone after lunch." He took a sip of coffee and winced at the bitterness. "Do you think they are together now?" he asked unexpectedly. Alice thought. Nolan stopped writing about an hour ago. Perhaps he gave up or found solace in the one who caused all this. "I guess," she said quietly. "They have no one else to go to." Victor smiled wryly. "It's a pity that we can't eavesdrop on their conversation. I wonder what they'll say to each other." "Nothing good, I'm sure," Alice replied. She didn't even want to imagine this scene. There was a risk that everything inside would flare up with pain again. But my imagination couldn't help but picture Nolan and Felicity sitting somewhere, looking at each other with a lost expression. He might be blaming her for everything coming to light. She might be sobbing, cursing her fate, or they might be trying to console themselves in each other's arms, convincing themselves that they would survive this together. In any case, the euphoria of secret love they must have been floating in for the last few months has burst. What remains is the hard reality, an almost tangible hangover after a long, intoxicating high. Victor cleared his throat quietly, distracting Alice from her thoughts. "Our mutual friend came to see me today. Well, one of those who sent me, 'Oh, did you see that your wife?'" I pretended to be surprised and thanked her for the news. Alice smiled sadly. "Are there rumors already?" "You bet." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I think half the city will know by tomorrow." "I don't care anymore," Alice admitted honestly. "Let them know. I'm not guilty of anything." Victor looked at her carefully. "And you really don't care?" She met his gaze. Something like pride stirred inside her. "No," she said firmly. "I don't care. I did the best I could." Victor smiled slightly, the first hint of approval she had seen all day. "This is right." He took the keys out of his pocket and handed them to her. "Here, this is from my apartment. You wanted to spend the night away from home, didn't you?" Alicesh nodded and carefully took the keys. She and Victor had agreed beforehand. She would stay with him tonight, and he would stay on duty at the clinic. Neither of them wanted to see their spouses. Moreover, Alice was afraid that Nolan might show up at home. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're welcome," Victor responded. "The apartment is empty. There are 2 rooms. Make yourself comfortable." Alice put the keys in her bag. They fell silent again. It got dark. The coffee got cold. But they both didn't want to go into the void. "What are you going to do next?" Victor asked after a pause. Alicesh tiredly ran her finger along the edge of the cup. "I'll apply for leave from work. Then, I want to leave, far away from here." "For how long?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "There are just too many memories here. I might move away completely." Victor nodded understandingly. "I'm thinking of changing the scenery too," he said. "Everything here reminds me of her now." "Yes," Alice sighed. Austin became a different city overnight. She suddenly felt gratitude for this man across from her. Without him, she might have been sitting there broken, but she held on, and Victor held on. They had been through hell together, and even though there was still a lot of pain ahead, they had survived this day. "You know," Alice said quietly, "I think we should take a break from everything for a little bit. Tomorrow, just not think about any of that stuff. How? He raised his eyebrows questioningly. Let's go somewhere in nature, she suggested unexpectedly to herself. Hill country is not far away. We'll get some food, drink some wine by the lake. Victor looked surprised at first, but then a slight smile touched his lips. Sounds good. Do you think it will help? Alice shrugged. I don't know, but it definitely won't get worse. Victor nodded. Okay, let's go tomorrow after lunch, and I'll sort things out in the morning. They agreed to meet the next day and, having paid, rose from the table. As Alice was about to leave, Victor suddenly hugged her gently, in a friendly but warm way. She froze for a moment and then patted him on the back. Thank you, he whispered. We did everything right. Thank you too, she replied. Pulling away, they looked at each other again. There were tears in Victor's eyes, but he held on. See you tomorrow, Alice, he said quietly. See you tomorrow, Victor. She watched him walk away down the sidewalk, joining the stream of people. Then she sighed, lifted her face to the night sky, and thought for the first time in a long time that maybe this nightmare would be the beginning of something new for her. Yes, it still hurts, but every new minute without lies and deceit is already a step towards healing. Late that evening, in a half-empty bar on the outskirts of Austin, two people sat at a distant table. Nolan and Felicity barely looked at each other. Nolan had a half-finished glass of whiskey in front of him. Felicity was fiddling with a damp handkerchief. So what now? Nolan asked dully, looking away. Everything collapsed. Felicity sobbed softly. I have nothing more to catch here. I'm flying to my parents tomorrow. I think it'll be better this way. Nolan nodded absently. They were silent for a few minutes. We probably shouldn't, he began, but stopped short. Yes, she whispered. It's not worth it. He finished his whiskey in one gulp and stood up. Felicity didn't even look up. There was no farewell hug. Both knew they had nothing to say to each other. Nolan threw the bills on the table and said quietly, Take care. Felicity just nodded in response, not getting up. A minute later, she saw his silhouette disappear behind the door. In the empty bar, only the ticking of the old clock could be heard for both of them. The party was over, leaving a bitter hangover. 2 days after the breakup, Alice stood at her bedroom window, watching the gray April rain drizzle into the garden. Her things were almost packed, suitcases lined up along the wall. Today, she had decided to finally leave the house that had once been her family home and was now a place of painful memories. On Tuesday, she spent the entire day out of town, driving with Victor to the hill country, sitting on the shore of a lake, barely saying a word, just looking at the water and trying to comprehend that their lives had been divided into before and after. She didn't want to return to reality, but she had to. Last night, Alice's lawyer told her that Nolan had agreed to the divorce terms. Apparently, the photos and the fear of scandal were enough to crush his morale. They hadn't seen each other face to face since the affair was revealed. Until now. Nolan called her that morning, the first time Alice had answered. She calmly informed him that she would be picking up her things after lunch and asked him to come over at that time for a quick chat about practical details. Her husband's voice sounded hoarse and subdued. He agreed. And now she waited. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, headlights flashed across the driveway as a familiar sedan pulled up in front of the house. Alice's heart sank, but she pulled herself together. The door opened and Nolan walked in, hunched over as if under a heavy load. He looked terrible. His eyes were red, his cheeks were stubbled, his clothes were carelessly put on. He stopped in the hallway, not daring to go any further. Alice silently walked out to meet him. For a few seconds, they just looked at each other. There he was, the man she once loved and now barely recognized. Hello, Nolan said with difficulty. Hello, she responded just as quietly. He glanced at the suitcases against the wall and swallowed nervously. So, you're leaving? Yes, Alice confirmed. I've rented an apartment for a month. Then I'll probably leave Austin for good. Nolan closed his eyes and ran his hand over his face. I'm sorry. He suddenly exhaled. Don't even know what to say. I have no excuses. Elisesh remained silent. The word forgive echoed strangely in her chest. It no longer meant anything. I've ruined everything, he continued bitterly. The studio will probably lose half its clients. My father thinks I'm a disgrace to the family. People point fingers in the street. He talked about his troubles, and Alice realized he still thought first of himself. Not a word about how she felt. For some reason, this finally sobered her up. I'm sorry it happened, she said mechanically. Nolan stepped closer, trying to catch her eye. Alice, I know I don't deserve it, but maybe we can try to start over. Without lies, without secret meetings. I realized everything really. I broke up with Felicity right away, I swear. I'm disgusted by what I did. Elisesh looked at him with a long, searching gaze. The self-confident, creative person her husband had been was barely recognizable in this exhausted man. He was pathetic now, and amazingly, she felt no malice or triumph, only tired sympathy. Nolan, she said quietly. No. He was about to say something else, but stopped himself. We won't get a second chance, Alice continued. It's over. You made your choice, and I made mine. A tear rolled down Nolan's cheek. He hung his head. You will never be able to forgive me, he whispered. Alice thought about it. Right now, no. Will it ever be able to? Maybe, but far in the future, when everything will no longer matter. It doesn't matter anymore, she answered evenly. Live as you wish. I wish you to improve and become better someday, but without me. Nolan buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Alice didn't move. She knew he was going through a personal breakdown, but it was a breakdown of his own making. A few minutes passed. Nolan calmed down a little, straightened up, and wiped his face with his sleeve. You took Orion? He suddenly asked, looking around. Alice was taken aback. What Orion? A Labrador puppy, he said hoarsely. I went to pick him up from the kennel this morning. I wanted to give him to you so that. His voice broke. I thought maybe that would make it up to you a little. Alice froze in surprise. A puppy? A Labrador? She'd never asked, but they'd talked about getting a dog if they'd had more time. Was this really Nolan's way of trying to fix everything? No, she said quietly. Nobody gave me a puppy. Nolan closed his eyes and smiled bitterly. So I missed this too. Apparently the nursery gave it to someone else. I was late. Alice didn't know what to say. The lump in her throat made it hard to speak. Had someone else taken the Labrador named Orion that was meant for her somewhere today? Well, that was probably the case. Nolan shook his head, as if finally giving in. It's clear. He took a step towards the door. He turned around one last time. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Forgive me, Alice. She nodded silently. Nolan lowered his eyes and stepped out into the drizzling rain. A moment later, Alice saw from the window his car disappear around the corner. She exhaled, feeling like she had survived another test. The dominoes continued to fall. The marriage was ruined, Nolan's career was in jeopardy, their future together was erased. But somewhere in the distance, there was a glimmer of new freedom. Alice's phone vibrated. A message from Victor. Felicity moved in with a friend, quit her job. Moving in with my brother in San Antonio for a while. How are you? She replied, I'm holding on. Nolan's gone. I'll be in touch soon. After gathering the last of her bags, Alice looked around the empty rooms. The magnet from Seattle was still hanging on the refrigerator, the same one she and Nolan had bought when they were happy tourists. She ripped it off and threw it in the trash. The past was shattered. The dominoes of her old life had crumbled. Ahead lay the unknown. But at least now she belonged only to herself. Alice stood for a couple of minutes in the middle of the empty living room. Her throat suddenly tightened with a lump. An entire chapter of her life had ended. She allowed herself one brief weakness, a few hot tears still ran down her cheeks. But she wiped them away immediately. She didn't want to cry anymore. Elisesh closed the door behind her and, without looking back, left the house after the storm forever. It was a hot May when Alice Langley left Texas, heading northwest. In the trunk of her car were all the things she had decided to keep: a couple of suitcases of clothes, a box of her favorite books, a laptop, and a few photos from her childhood. Everything else furniture, old gifts, household items she had sold or given away. Letting go of the past was surprisingly easy. There was a long road ahead. From Austin to Seattle is almost 2,000 miles. Alice decided not to rush. She took a week's time to see the country and be alone with her thoughts. The first 100 miles were endless Texas flatlands. The hot air shimmered over the highway, the radio played country music softly. Alice felt strangely calm. She was saying goodbye to this land without pain. Too much bad was holding on here. On the third day, Alice was driving through Colorado, the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains visible in the distance. The night before, while staying overnight in southern Utah, she had gotten into a conversation at a motel with an elderly couple traveling in an old van. When they learned that Alice was driving across the country alone, they wished her luck and said with a smile, "The road itself will tell you where you need to go." These simple words unexpectedly echoed in her soul, giving her confidence. In the morning, when she drove out onto the highway, she could not resist turning towards one of the viewing platforms. As she got out of the car, she felt the cool mountain breeze. The peaks sparkled in the sun, and somewhere below ran a clear river. Such grandeur of nature made her petty worries recede. Alice took a deep breath of the mountain air and suddenly realized she felt good. For the first time in a long time, truly calm and good. On the way, she called her loved ones. She called her mother and promised to get in touch as soon as she settled in. Of course, her mother was worried about the divorce, but she supported her daughter's decision to start from scratch. Victor also called. They exchanged news. He said that the divorce was going well, he moved the clinic to San Antonio, and was gradually getting back to normal. They did not communicate with Felicity. Alice said that she had almost reached Seattle. Victor wished her luck. They agreed to call each other later. Their voices sounded cheerful. Life was getting better, each on their own path. On the fourth day of her journey, she crossed the Utah border and headed through arid valleys toward the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. At a roadside motel, she got into conversation that evening with an elderly couple traveling in an old van. When they learned that Alice was traveling so far alone, they wished her luck and said a simple thing: "The road itself will tell you where you need to go." These words resonated with her soul. On the fifth day of the journey, the horizons began to change. The deserts were left behind, greenery, hills appeared, and then the snow cap of Mount Rainier sparkled ahead, a sure sign that Washington was close. Alice stopped at the last rest stop before Seattle and took a photo for memory. She was in front of a road sign, "Seattle 30 miles, smiling at the new times. As she drove into the city, Alice couldn't quite believe that she had decided to take such a bold step. Seattle greeted her with drizzling rain and coolness. The city was buried in greenery and seemed welcoming even through the gray sky. In the distance, she saw the outlines of the Space Needle, the famous tower, and an involuntary smile touched her lips. Here it was, a new starting point. She found the right area, a quiet, green corner north of the center, where she rented a small apartment. The apartment was bright and cozy, with windows overlooking the park. The simplest furniture was already waiting for her. Alice had arranged for the owners to furnish the dwelling with the bare necessities. She brought in boxes and suitcases and sat down tiredly on the sofa. Well, she thought, I'm home. Home. How unusual it was to apply this word to a new place. But she decided, from now on, her home is where she feels good and calm. It was still empty and quiet here, but it was a peaceful silence, not oppressive like that time in the house after the storm. Elisa, first of all, I unpacked my things, put the books on the shelf, and hung a couple of photos with my parents on the wall. I put my favorite mug in the kitchen, the same one from which I drank coffee on my best mornings. Let such mornings begin here too. Right before bed, the doorbell rang. It turned out to be the neighbor from downstairs, an elderly lady who brought a homemade pie as a greeting to the new settler. Alice was so surprised that she almost burst into tears and thanked her as best she could. She was pleased to feel the goodwill in the new place. In the evening, having settled down on the mattress, the bed would be delivered only tomorrow. She scrolled through the feed on her phone. Her ex-husband no longer wrote to her apparently. He had resigned himself to it. Nothing was heard from Felicity. She had probably left the city to wait out the scandal. This no longer worried Alice. The echo of the recent scandal was gradually dying away somewhere far behind. Before going to bed, she went out onto the balcony with a cup of tea. A light rain was falling. The air smelled fresh and pine-scented. Somewhere in the distance, rare rumbles of thunder were heard over the city. Seattle was greeting her with the rumbles of a new thunderstorm. But Alice's soul was calm. The storm that had almost destroyed her was behind her, and now clear horizons stretched out ahead. A few weeks passed, and Alice's life in Seattle was beginning to settle into a routine. She was enjoying her new job. She spent her days coding, getting to know her coworkers, and settling into her new place. But in the evenings, when she returned to her empty apartment, she felt something was missing. Or rather, someone. One Saturday, Alice was walking through the local farmer's market when she noticed a table by the entrance with a sign that read, "Friends Forever Shelter Looking for Adoptables." There was a volunteer at the table with a black, shiny Labrador puppy with huge paws dozing at her feet. Alice's heart began to beat faster. She had been thinking about getting a dog for a long time, but she kept putting it off. And then, like a sign of fate, there was a puppy right in front of her. "Can I pet you?" she asked timidly, approaching. "Of course," the girl smiled. Elisesh crouched down and held out her hand. The puppy lifted his muzzle, sniffed the air, and licked her fingers. Then he stood up, clumsily ran closer, and nuzzled his forehead into her palm. Alice laughed, the first time she had laughed so sincerely in a long time. "Wow, he seems to like you," the volunteer noted. "His name is Orion. He's a very affectionate boy." "Orion?" Alice asked, stroking the puppy's ears. "He has a little white spot on his chest, like a star," the girl explained, stroking the puppy. "We named the whole litter after constellations." Elisesh looked closer. Yes, on the puppy's black silky fur, a tiny, irregular diamond was white at his throat like a lonely star in the night sky. She felt a warm thrill. The name suited the baby surprisingly well. The puppy, meanwhile, resolutely climbed onto her lap and fell belly up, demanding to be scratched. Alice felt her eyes fill with tears, happy ones this time. "I think I'm in love," she said, half jokingly, half seriously. "How can I take it away?" The volunteer bustled about happily, handing over the papers. "Oh, that's great. You just need to fill out a form, and you can take him today. He's vaccinated. He's 3 months old, healthy. A little mischievous, but very smart." Alice, with a smile, she began the formalities. Orion had been sitting next to her the whole time, pressed against her leg, as if he was afraid that she would leave. She stroked his back, calming him down and calming herself down at the same time. An hour later, all the documents were ready. Alice, having said goodbye to the volunteers, led Orion to the car. He jumped around, getting tangled in the new leash, and yapped happily. "Well, my friend, let's go home," Alice said affectionately, placing the puppy in the back seat. Pleasant chores awaited her at home. She had bought bowls, food, and several toys in advance, as if she had a premonition that she would soon bring her four-legged friend. Orion greedily lapped up the water, then began to explore the apartment, rustling his nose in every corner. That evening, Alice sat on the living room floor, watching Orion play with a rubber ball. A warm feeling spread through her heart. She was no longer alone. This little bundle of energy and love looked at her with guileless eyes, as if to say, "You are my man." "Yes, baby, I'm your man," Alice whispered, stroking the big-eared head. Orion barked happily and licked her cheek. Alice laughed. Of course, there were a lot of worries ahead of her walks at dawn in the rain, training, chewed shoes. But all this seemed insignificant in comparison with the joy and comfort that the puppy brought with him. Before going to bed, Alice texted Victor. She sent him a photo of herself holding Orion and the caption, "Meet Orion. I think we're saving each other." Victor responded almost immediately with a smiley face and warm words of congratulations. He jokingly asked if she wanted to train the dog with him. Alice laughed, answering that she could handle it herself. Although she admitted to herself, taming the little whirlwind was quite a task. When Alice went to bed, she didn't chase the puppy out of the bedroom, let him get used to it. Orion settled on the rug next to the bed, but soon moved closer and curled up right at her feet. The night passed restlessly. A couple of times Orion woke up and called her with a thin whine, and Alice lowered her hand from the bed, calming him with caresses. But by morning, they were both fast asleep. Awakened at dawn by a warm lick on her cheek, Alice was at first confused, but then realized it was a small alarm clock named Orion who needed a walk. Half asleep, she got dressed and went out with him onto the deserted wooden terrace in front of the house. An early rain was drizzling, the sky was just turning gray. The puppy was delightedly sniffing the air, studying the new smells, and Alice, yawning, could not hold back a smile. Her morning began completely differently than before, and there was a special happiness in this. "Good night, my dear," she whispered to the puppy late at night, turning off the light. A steady, plump snore could be heard in the darkness. Alice felt the warmth of this living creature at her feet, giving her peace. She had once dreamed of a child, but now she realized that first she had to learn to be happy herself. And Orion was the first step on that path. While the puppy was sleeping, Alice quietly said into thin air, "Thank you." It didn't matter who she was grateful to, fate, chance, herself. It just seemed to her at that moment that fate had finally given her the right guide, her own Orion, who would lead her forward. The Fall Developer Conference in San Francisco was in full swing. Alice, invited by her new employer, flew in for a couple of days to listen to talks and meet people in the industry. After a turbulent year, the trip seemed like a walk in the park. Between sessions, she stood in line for coffee in the lobby of the Moscone Convention Center, surrounded by dozens of voices, clinks of glassware, and animated discussions about new technologies. "Alice, is that you?" suddenly came from behind her in English with surprised intonations. She turned around and at first couldn't believe her eyes. In front of her stood a tall guy of about 35, wearing glasses and with the widest grin on his face. Brown hair, a dimple on his chin. Kai Monroe," Alice exclaimed, recognizing her classmate from the University of Texas. He laughed joyfully and spread his arms. "What a meeting. Let me hug you, shall I?" Alice, laughing, let him hug her tightly. They hadn't seen each other for over 10 years since graduation. They had once been close friends. They had studied for exams together, gone on hikes with the student club. Kai had always been the life of the party, and it seemed he hadn't changed a bit. "What brings you here?" she blurted out, stepping back. "Are you going to the conference too?" "Yeah," he nodded. "I work nearby. We were invited." "Listen, you haven't changed at all." "Well, no, you have changed. You've become even more beautiful." Alice felt my cheeks warm up from the compliment. "Thank you," she smiled. "You look great too. A little older, but still the same Kai." They received their cups of coffee and walked over to the window, continuing to study each other with admiration. "I heard you moved to Seattle," Kai said. "Saw a post from some mutual friends." "Yes, recently," Alice confirmed. "I work there now." She kept silent about the personal reasons for the move, only adding, "I wanted a change." Kai nodded understandingly. "Well, Seattle is a cool city. I go there sometimes for work. Our partner's head office is there." "Really?" She perked up. "There will be a reason to see each other." Kai smiled with his eyes. "Definitely. Are you staying in San Francisco for long?" "I'm leaving tomorrow," Alice answered. "I only managed to attend a conference. I barely saw the city." Kai waved his hand. "If you want, I'll show you a couple of my favorite places tonight. Without tourists, honestly." Alice felt a long-forgotten excitement. She felt surprisingly light and pleasant next to Kai, as if they were those carefree students again. "With pleasure," she said. I'm free after the last report. Great. Kai glanced at his watch. We can meet at the entrance at 6 o'clock. We'll go have dinner at a cool place. They agreed on a time, chatted for a few minutes more about the conference, and then business separated them. Alice found herself looking forward to the evening for the rest of the day. At 6, they met at the main entrance. Kai suggested walking. Fortunately, the weather was warm and sunny. They wandered the streets of San Francisco without a specific route. They passed the noisy Chinatown with its paper lanterns, climbed a hill from where a view of the bay with the lights of the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance opened up. Chatting incessantly, they remembered old friends, student pranks. Passing by the sparkling windows of cafes and climbing steep hills, they laughed and did not notice the fatigue. At some point, they stopped at the top of the hill, from where the bay and the lights of the Golden Gate Bridge were visible in the distance, and Alice felt how much joy this unplanned walk brought. Over dinner at a small family restaurant, they began to talk more seriously. Kai admitted that he had been married for several years, but had gotten divorced. Work had absorbed all his attention, and the relationship had not survived. I know what you mean, Alice said quietly. I went through that recently, too. Kai gently touched her hand on the table. Sorry, I didn't know. I hope you're okay. Alicesh nodded. Surprisingly, while talking about this with him, she did not feel any sharp pain, only a slight sadness, like from touching an old, already healed scar. Already okay, she answered honestly. It was hard, but now everything is different. I'm glad to hear it. You're strong, Alice. Always knew it, he said sincerely. Alice felt her chest tingle again under his gaze. She looked away to hide her embarrassment and changed the subject, asking about his job. Kai enthusiastically told her about his current days and the startup where he worked as a CTO. The evening flew by. The twilight thickened unnoticed. The streetlights lit up along the sidewalks. They didn't even notice how the sky darkened and the city lights came on. When they left the restaurant, the stars were already lit up over the city. Kai insisted on walking Alice to the hotel. They stopped at the entrance, not wanting to say goodbye. I'm so lucky to have met you today, Kai admitted. So many years, but it feels like we never got lost. I'm very glad, too, Alice smiled. If you're ever in Seattle, be sure to let me know. Of course, he confirmed. And call me if you're in our area. Alicesh took out her phone, and they exchanged new numbers. Kai hesitated for a moment, then leaned over slightly and quickly kissed her on the cheek. It was nice to see you, Alice. She felt a pleasant warmth from his short kiss. Me too, Kai, she said quietly. See you soon. He waved goodbye and disappeared into the evening crowd. Alice stood at the entrance for a few more seconds, feeling her heart beat a little faster than usual. That evening, she couldn't sleep for a long time. Bright pictures popped into her head, Kai laughing at her joke, Kai touching her hand, Kai seeing her off, and there was hope in his eyes. Alice understood. Perhaps this was just old friendship, a warm memory. But she wanted to believe that fate had not brought them together again by chance. At the very least, she had made a good friend. Or maybe... She stopped herself, not wanting to guess. The main thing was that she again felt excitement, anticipation, those feelings that she had long avoided out of fear. Before going to bed, Alice texted Victor, briefly telling him how she had unexpectedly met an old friend and had a great time. Victor responded almost immediately, I'm happy for you. You deserve it. Alice closed her eyes and smiled. Yes, it seemed that life was slowly starting to improve and bring pleasant surprises. She was ready to accept them without fear and looking back at the past. Late fall in Seattle was the season of long rains and early twilight. On one such evening, Alice was curled up on the couch at home, wrapped in a blanket. Orion was dozing at her feet after a fun walk through puddles. A lamp was burning in the room, casting a soft light on the freshly painted walls. It was a quiet day. Alice had returned from work early. The manager had sent the team off to celebrate the successful release of the project. There was peace in her soul. Life had improved in the last few months. The divorce was officially finalized. The documents had arrived by mail 2 weeks ago. She put the divorce certificate in a folder as a formal end to that story. Checking her email on her laptop, Alice noticed a new email in her inbox. Subject, sorry. The sender's address seemed familiar. Her heart sank. It was from Felicity Reed. Elisesh didn't immediately decide to open it. Her hands froze over the keyboard. Orion, sensing her tension, raised his head and barked questioningly. "It's okay, baby," she said quietly, stroking the dog. "Just old business." Finally, she clicked on the letter. The letter contained words of apology. "Dear Alice, I'm not sure if I have the right to write to you, but I still want to ask for forgiveness. I'm incredibly sorry that I caused you so much pain. There is no justification for what I did, and I'm not looking for one. I just want you to know that I regret what I did every day. I hope that someday you can forgive me, at least in the depths of your soul. Sincerely, Felicity." Alice reread these lines several times. She expected anger, indignation, but there was none of that. Only quiet sadness and perhaps a drop of sympathy. Felicity had also paid a high price. She had lost her husband, her job, her reputation. Perhaps she, too, was in great pain. Orion nuzzled her knee with his warm nose, as if reminding her of his presence. Alice looked up from the screen and smiled at her loyal friend. She wondered, should she answer? Should she forgive? Deep down, she knew that this forgiveness was needed not so much by Felicity, but by herself in order to finally free herself from the past. Elisesh remembered how broken she had felt a year ago when the world had collapsed. She remembered the sleepless nights, the tears, the anger, and now it was gone. There were scars, but they didn't hurt if you left them alone. She had already let go of the situation with Nolan. His betrayal no longer dictated her feelings. Maybe it was time to let go of her resentment towards Felicity. Alice closed her laptop. She didn't respond to the letter. Some doors are better left closed. But in her soul, she suddenly felt liberated, as if the weight had finally lifted. Yes, she was forgiving silently for herself without renewing the connection. That was enough. For the first time, she clearly felt the past was let go, not out of bitterness, but out of true acceptance. She rose to make herself some tea. Orion, hearing the familiar word tea, she always gave him a treat after dinner while the tea was brewing, briskly rose after her. "Come on, sweetie," Alice called. In the kitchen, she put the kettle on and threw Orion his favorite cookie. He caught it in mid-air and wagged his tail, pleased. While the aromatic jasmine tea was brewing, Alice approached the balcony door. A monotonous rain was falling behind the glass. Somewhere in the distance, rare lights were sparkling. The city was living its own life. She remembered a phrase she had once read: "When one door closes, another opens." In her case, so many new doors had opened. A new career, a new city, new friends. And some doors, the doors of the past, had closed forever, and she would not knock on them again. Elisesh pulled a keychain out of her pocket. Among them was one that didn't fit anywhere else, the key to the house in Austin she'd sold a month ago. She'd carried it around as a reminder for a long time, but now it was time to get rid of it. She took the key off the ring and resolutely dropped it into the tin can where she kept all sorts of small junk. The door of that house no longer existed for her. By releasing the past, she finally felt truly free. The tea was ready. Alice poured it into her favorite mug and returned to the living room. Orion had already taken his place on the sofa and was wagging his tail, inviting her to sit next to him. She sat down, crossing her legs, and took a sip of the hot infusion. Ahead was the evening, comfort, peace. Ahead was a new page of life, which she was writing herself. Elisesh glanced at the phone lying next to her. A message from Kai Monroe appeared on the screen. He was going to fly to Seattle in a week and wanted to meet. The girl smiled, answering with consent. Well, this door was open, and she was not afraid to walk through it. Orion laid his muzzle on her lap, asking for attention. Alice put down her mug and scratched the dog behind the ear. "Well, my friend," she said quietly, "it seems like everything will be fine." The rain pounded outside, but the house was warm, and no thunderstorm could frighten Alice anymore. The doors of the past had closed, and she would not knock on them again. New doors had opened in her life, and she was heading there, boldly and with faith in herself. A year had passed since Alice first learned of the betrayal. It seemed like a lifetime. The day before, her mother had called her from Austin. They had talked for a long time. Her mother had been worried about her daughter all year, and now there was joy and pride in her voice. "You have become even stronger, my daughter. Remember, after every storm, the sun always comes out," she said at last, and these words finally convinced Alice that she was on the right track. For the first time in many months, she greeted the past holidays with a smile. She spent Christmas with her parents in her home, feeling the care of her family, and realized that she no longer felt lonely. Every day now brought her a little joy. The bright spring sun gilded the young green leaves and crowns of the pine trees in one of the Seattle parks, where Alice sat on the grass, watching Orion scurry across the clearing after a thrown stick. An open book lay on a blanket nearby, and half-drunk coffee from a thermos was cooling. "He seems tired," a cheerful voice said behind him. Elisesh turned around and smiled. Kai Monroe was walking towards her, waving another stick for playing with the dog. Orion instantly switched over and ran towards him, wagging his tail. "You have an endless supply of energy, buddy," laughed Kai, when the puppy, almost an adult dog, now jumped up and deftly snatched the stick from his hands. "He could run like that all day," Alice confirmed, patting the blanket next to her. "Come on." Kai sat down next to her. He and Alice were spending more and more weekends together. The friendship that had begun anew with that chance meeting was gradually growing into something more, although neither was in a hurry to put labels on it. They just had fun together, and that was enough. "What are you thinking about?" Kai asked softly, noticing her absent-minded look. Alice leaned back on her elbows, looking at the cloudless sky. "You know, about how everything can change in a year, where I was this time last year and where I am now." Kai nodded after a pause. "It was a tough year," he said, "but you made it through." Alice smiled, feeling a warm wave of gratitude to fate, to friends, to her former self who had not broken. "Yes," she agreed quietly, "I did it." She remembered herself, broken and confused, the one who a year ago sat in an empty house after a thunderstorm and saw no way out. Then it seemed that there were only ruins of hope ahead. But from those ruins, she managed to build a new foundation, strong, although still modest. On the ruins of her former life, she was reborn from the ashes, strong, confident, free, and truly happy. Alice built a new life on this foundation. Time, support from loved ones, and even a little therapy healed the wounds, and she had found inner support. She learned not to be afraid to ask for help, talk about pain and accept support, learned to trust herself and value herself. She stopped doubting her own value. Neither betrayal nor loneliness could shake her self-confidence now. Her value is determined only by herself, neither the opinion of strangers, nor the status of a married woman, nor the presence of a partner nearby make her either better or worse. Now she knows for sure. She is self-sufficient, and even alone she can be happy, and no blows of fate will take away her self-respect. Kai, as if guessing the course of her thoughts, lightly touched her hand. "You are incredible, you know?" Elisesh chuckled sheepishly. "Why all of a sudden? Maybe you're confusing me with someone else," she joked. "Because after everything you've been through, you still have the ability to enjoy life, to love." He nodded at Orion, who had returned and was now resting his head on her lap, breathing heavily after the race. "To love this tailed one, friends. Maybe one day, someone special again." Elisesh placed her hand on Orion's silky fur and thought about Kai's words. Yes, her heart was no longer locked. There was a person next to her with whom she felt calm and warm, perhaps even love was beginning to blossom. But what was more important was that she was no longer afraid of this love. She did not cling to it out of need, as she had once clung to a shaky marriage, but could share it freely and consciously. "I'm glad that life brought us together again," she said, looking into Kai's eyes. "I don't know what will happen next, but I'm grateful for now. Kai smiled and covered her palm with his. Me too, he responded quietly, and there was sincerity in his voice. They sat there for a few minutes in a silence that didn't require words. Orion curled up next to them, closing his eyes. The sun warmed their faces, the breeze brought the scent of blooming rhododendrons. Birds were chirping somewhere in the sky. Alice felt a deep calm. People were walking around the park, young parents with strollers, an elderly couple hand in hand, cheerful groups of friends. Life went on, and Alice, sitting on the grass next to the person who was dear to her, understood that she had become a part of it again, bright, rich, real. Well, maybe we should take a walk to the lake, Kai suggested, standing up and holding out his hand to her. There's a nice view of the mountains not far from here. Alice took the hand and easily jumped to her feet. Let's. Orion immediately stood up, wagging his tail, anticipating new impressions. They walked forward under the gentle rustling of the pines, Kai holding her hand, Orion running ahead, showing the way. Alice walked confidently, with a smile on her face. Her new chapter of life was just beginning, and in it, she was the author, the creator, and the main character. She survived, of course. She survived. From the ruins of her former life, she rose from the ashes strong, confident, free, and truly happy. Thank you, Alice whispered, either to herself or to the heavens, and confidently took a step towards her future. She was not afraid of the future because now the future was in her hands. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.